Hello, everyone. My name is Jim Beauregard. I'm one of the Associated Scholars at the Hildebrand Project, and it's my pleasure today to introduce our two speakers on the topic of suffering. We've been privileged to hear them both so far this week, so I'm just going to give a very short introduction, which gives them more time to talk and you more time to ask questions. Peter Colosi is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Salve Regina University in Rhode Island, and Margarita Mooney is currently an associate professor at Princeton Theological Seminary and founder and executive director of the Scholar Foundation. And I expect we'll be hearing a little more about both of those, but why don't we just jump in and get started? And our topic today is suffering, Personalist Vision. And so I think, Peter, you said you would want to go first.
Yep.
Okay, take it away.
Okay, I will go first. And I'm going to actually just read my paper. And so I was tasked to say something about suffering in this talk, and also to comment on the debates about the legalization of physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia. So how can human beings understand suffering? Is there an answer to the human yearning to understand suffering, why it exists, and whether it has any meaning? It first must be noted that this is an area where faith and reason overlap, perhaps more so than in many other areas. With suffering, we deal with a mystery that seems to have no bottom. And this is when reason, in an attitude of humility, recognizes its limits and turns to God, or as also happens, turns to despair. Max Shaler and Karol Wojtyła have written on this topic. Shaler wrote a profound short essay titled The Meaning of Suffering, and Karol Wojtyła, as Pope John Paul II, wrote an apostolic letter titled On the Christian Meaning of Human Suffering, Salvifici Doloris. These two works cohere very well with each other, and we know that Wojtyła was influenced deeply by Shaler. The main theme concerning the mystery of suffering in both Shaler and John Paul is the relationship between love and suffering. In these two documents, the authors do not discuss the question of euthanasia or physician-assisted suicide, but it is interesting to note that the proponents of legalizing physician-assisted suicide claim to be acting in love and compassion, while on the other hand, John Paul and the Catholic tradition, but also and indeed the Hippocratic tradition, hold that to kill the sick is by nature the opposite of love and can in no way be compassionate. This raises the profound question, which side is right, and why do they both claim to be the loving ones? The main idea in Shaler and John Paul II is the maximization of love in the world. This is developed by John Paul by saying that suffering is present in the world in order to unleash love. His idea is that there is a three-part unleashing of love. First, what he calls the internal unleashing of love in the hearts of individuals. This is an affective or emotional experience of love, that feeling of love and compassion that fills your heart when you are in the presence of someone in pain who needs help. Second, the external unleashing of love. This pertains to actions which are carried out to bring about relief for those who are suffering. And thirdly, what he calls the cultural unleashing of love. And here we might think of the phrase, a civilization of love, coined by Pope St. Paul VI and made famous by John Paul. This cultural unleashing of love refers to the widespread influence the first two types of unleashing can eventually have on the ethos of an entire culture and society. In such a society, the sick and the suffering would be the center of attention, concern, care, and love, and they would not be isolated, ignored, or relegated to the sidelines. John Paul's idea, and that of Shaler, is that the interior unleashing or effective inner experience of the feeling of love in one's heart has a priority over the external and cultural. And this is because, as Hildebrand would say, unless one brings one's heart to a person in pain, one has not brought oneself. And Benedict XVI also makes this point in Deus Caritas Est. In other words, that interior love in the heart forms and enriches the external help one brings to the suffering person. This does not mean that the feeling of love alone, without actually helping, is enough. It's not. It's just that without that genuine warmth of heart, the external help may very well never occur. And even if some actual help does occur, it will be impoverished from a personalist perspective. Benedict XVI notes very beautifully that in addition to the technical skill and medical training so important in the service to the sick, even healthcare professionals, in other words, not just family members and loved ones, also need to give the patients the look of love which they crave, Benedict says. So, pertaining to euthanasia, the question is, can it ever be the case that in the relationship between the one relieving suffering and the one in pain, that a deliberate act of killing can be an act of love? Or is this intrinsically impossible? If it is an intrinsic necessity that to kill in order to relieve pain is antithetical to love, can that intrinsic necessity be brought to evidence? The starting point in pondering this would be to consider possible candidates that are the opposites to love, for there are more than one of these. The most obvious opposite to love is hatred. I think we can say that in most cases of physician-assisted suicide, those participating do not bear hatred toward the patient or loved one. And in fact, they likely have some level of a subjective feeling of genuine love toward them. And so hatred is not the intrinsic opposite to love contained within assisted suicide. It's not. Okay. Another opposite to love, different from hatred, is use. John Paul, as Karol Wojtyła, wrote about this opposite to love in his book, Love and Responsibility. Here too, use is not the intrinsic opposite to love in the case of physician-assisted suicide. Now, before coming to a third opposite to love, it must sadly be noted that when it comes to the widespread phenomenon of what's called elder abuse, both hatred and use, particularly in the form of desiring more inheritance money, can and do play a role in physician-assisted suicide, particularly since the lethal dose is a prescription that is taken at home, and thus it cannot be known if coercion or even trickery by slipping the medication into the person has not happened. Nonetheless, these opposites to love, hatred, and use are not intrinsic to euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide, and we are looking for an intrinsic and unavoidable opposite to love. A third opposite to love is abandonment or indifference. This is the opposite to love that seems intrinsically and objectively linked and inseparable from euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide. The reason why physician-assisted suicide is intrinsically opposed to love is because it is an abandonment of a person in the moment when they are most vulnerable and most in need of loving support, care, and encouragement. I will present now 3 brief ways to bring this to further evidence, and then I'll conclude with one personalist sort of conclusion. So first, in his famous oath, Hippocrates vowed, quote, "I will never give a deadly drug to anybody who asked for it, nor will I make a suggestion to this effect," end quote. I often wonder about this suggestion point. Of course, doctors shouldn't encourage patients to bring about their own deaths, but why exactly? Through legalization of euthanasia, the healthy of society, however unwittingly, make one big suggestion to the sick that they should end their lives. Perhaps Hippocrates understood that within this suggestion, there is an unavoidable coercive element. The legal permission for assisted suicide plants in vulnerable minds thoughts that they are a burden, and soon the right begins to feel like a duty, the duty to die. Now, pressure from doctors, which was Hippocrates' concern, would be bad enough, but from everyone, it becomes unbearable. And in fact, it becomes abandonment that surrounds the sick. Personalists put a high priority on freedom. Legalizing euthanasia squashes freedom by introducing a coercive element of pressure. Whereas in places where euthanasia is illegal, this pressure is absent and replaced with a reassurance that my people like me. They don't want to kill me. They want to be with me and care for me until I die a natural death. Second point, these euthanasia and physician-assisted suicide laws bring about a 180-degree shift in law, medicine, and society by rejecting the age-old principle that doctors will never apply their medical knowledge to willfully cause the death of a patient. They enshrine in law the opposite principle that doctors will employ their medical knowledge to cause the death of a patient. Now, because physician-assisted suicide is a willful act of killing, a large percentage of these laws and bills are spent reassuring doctors, patients, family members, and healthcare facilities that they will not be prosecuted under other long-standing sections of homicide, suicide, and insurance law. One example pertains to what are called duty to aid laws. If you are present and watch a person die after ingesting the legal dose prescribed by the doctor, you will not be prosecuted, it says in these laws, for not rendering aid to a person in grave physical harm. To avoid triggering that prosecution, the current bill here in Rhode Island simply asserts that a person who takes this lethal dose and is dying in front of you, quote, shall not be considered a person exposed to grave physical harm, end quote. But they obviously are a person exposed to grave physical harm. There are many other examples of wordsmithing exceptions to established homicide, suicide, and insurance laws throughout these laws and bills. One point is these verbal gymnastics cannot bode well for the consistency of law in general, but more importantly, they betray the truth that there is an inherent contradiction between killing and loving that has been known for millennia. Third, once legalized, the range of people given access to euthanasia or assisted suicide always expands, which Amanda brought out earlier in the week. Eventually, even to those who are not terminally ill. So in Holland, psychiatric euthanasia is legal. In 2020, these numbers just came out. 1,412 people who took advantage of the euthanasia law there in the year 2020 put down as the reason loneliness. In Ireland, there's actually a call for assisted suicide to be available for everyone. No restrictions. The pro-legalization side responds to this concern, known as the slippery slope, by saying that the safeguards built into the law will protect against what they call abuses. So safeguards are these restrictions in these laws that have to be met prior to getting the prescription. So some examples are waiting periods between multiple requests, psychological evaluations, prognosis of a 6-month life expectancy, and so on. But this response of the pro-legalization side is a red herring based on an equivocation on the term abuse. What the pro-legalization side means by an abuse is the euthanizing of any patient who has not fulfilled one or more of the requirements. But the truth is that to deliberately cause the death of anyone, including the people who meet all the requirements, is already an abuse. So the real reason why euthanasia laws always expand is not because people are weak at sticking to the requirements. It's rather because we've taken that faithful step to enshrine willful killing by doctors into our laws and into our medical ethos. At that point, tussling over requirements becomes a relatively minor matter. Indeed, the original restrictions begin to seem unfair to those who want physician-assisted suicide and are not within those restrictions. And so they get removed one by one. And this always happens, and it's because we did that 180. And then loneliness becomes a legal reason to get such a prescription when you're not sick. Okay, my final paragraph. The pro-life position is in favor of palliative and hospice care if it respects the preciousness of every person by recognizing the difference between staying with a patient and loved one until their natural death versus abandoning them to suicide. There's a book called Being Mortal by Atul Gawande. And the author describes many imaginative, beautiful, and successful examples of healthcare facilities that have focused on relieving the boredom, loneliness, helplessness, and isolation that often accompany old age and illness. Personalism can provide the beautiful underlying vision which can inspire society to pursue and create initiatives like the ones mentioned in Being Mortal, and thereby bring about the external unleashing of love called for by John Paul II, informed by the interior warmth of heart, without which there would be no motivation to do so. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And now let us turn to Margaret. Just let me mention too, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. Since we're a smaller group, if you'd like to say them out loud, let me know in the Q&A and I can unmute you and you can speak. Margarita.
Thank you. That was a fantastic presentation. I am going to be referring back to some of the things that you said about the importance of love when discussing physician-assisted suicide, but I mostly want to share with listeners some of the insights that I've gained on other issues that are really important today with regards to suffering, and that is mental illness and drug addiction. I actually studied psychology as an undergraduate at Yale University and then sociology for my PhD. And it was when I was already a professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill that I began to really delve into theology and philosophy that talks about human suffering, because I saw that in one way or another, the field of sociology had tried to avoid questions of suffering, that everything about suffering is always bad and there's no such thing as growth from adversity. Or it tried to turn kind of suffering into a tool, right? That, oh, we can overcome anything, right? Kind of with this superhuman power. So I became really influenced by a virtue ethics perspective on human suffering and began to read Alasdair MacIntyre or Stanley Hauerwas. And then I set out to test some of these theories about adversity and resilience by interviewing young adults. I selected young adults from a national survey and picked those who said on the survey that they had some sort of traumatic life event. And I spent 2 years traveling around the country. I interviewed 26 young adults in 10 different states. I interviewed them 2 times. And what I came across, and this is very much related to what we just heard, what I came across was not only people who had suffered chronic mental illness and drug abuse, but people who were dealing with those issues largely alone. And what struck me, and I'll tell you now about one woman I met, her name was Laura. I met her in the South. She had been raised in a nominally Christian home, had even done some sort of Bible competitions in high school, but she was obese and always made fun of at school. And when she was in high school, she got pregnant and kept her baby. But her boyfriend developed a drug abuse problem, and he would also physically abuse her. She began to suffer from mental illness and depression and was taking, at one point, was taking 4 different medications for mental illness. And when I met her, she could barely meet my eyes and hold a conversation. She also told me that she got even more depressed when her beautiful baby that she loved more than anything in the world got out of the house and drowned in a little pond behind her house. When I came back to see her a year and a half later, she looked completely different. She had ended that relationship and she was no longer taking medications for mental illness. And what she told me really has stayed with me, because she said to me something that I heard again and again from people I interviewed, that the medication she was taking for mental illness took away the pain, but they also took away her joy, and she felt numb. And she kept saying, I want to feel like a person. She said that multiple times. This woman never finished high school. She's never read Personalism. She's probably never heard of it, and she probably never will. But something about the way that she had been treated made her feel like she was not a person. And by being a person, what did she mean? She meant that she wanted to feel the ups and downs of her emotions, and she didn't want to medicalize her sadness. Now, I'm not saying that there's no place for mental illness medications or that people suffering from anxiety or depression shouldn't take them. But I am saying, based on the interviews that I did with these young adults and from the data that I've looked on, we are over medicalizing suffering. And what happens when we over medicalize suffering, when the automatic reaction is to stifle the negative emotions? People aren't given the accompaniment and the companionship that they need to travel through the darkness. And so, is it surprising that in a society where we don't accompany people in the darkness, physician-assisted suicide for loneliness is something that people are increasingly asking for? And I'll point to another piece by Max Shaler that I use. I have not read his piece on suffering, but now I really want to. He has another piece on philosophical anthropology, on this question of the human person. And he says that the most important question of our time is the question of who are we as human beings? And he says that we've shifted from this idea of the human person as having a transcendent dimension that's open to spirituality and to a relationship with God. We've shifted into what he calls homo faber, that we're creatures who make things. And the problem is, for someone like Laura, she's not very productive. And so what is her worth? And what ends up happening for so many people like Laura, who don't seem to have a productive worth, we medicalize them. So at least they're not causing more problems. But then I think Max Shaler is very provocative, because one of his other understandings of the human person he says that we could adopt is decadent person. Well, maybe the fact that some people struggle with mental illness for a long time is not a sign that inside of us we can rise up and overcome all of our deficiencies if we just embrace courage and reject shame. If anybody knows who I'm paraphrasing here, I'm paraphrasing Brene Brown. There's a lot of good in Brene Brown, but ultimately her work on resilience and vulnerability, if you ask me, points to a kind of buffered self, not a self in relationship to another, not a Trinitarian self. But for someone like Laura, why should we conclude that deep down inside of her, she has the courage to overcome all of her problems? Maybe we should conclude, as Max Shaler said, that people like Laura are just proof that the human species is really decadent and destined to fail. And that actually maybe suicide is a really logical thing to do. Now, if I sound like I'm being provocative, I want to point out that I was on a panel about suicide during COVID. I was on a panel about suicide in February 2021 as part of the New York Encounter. And there was a philosopher on the panel, Mary Townsend from St. John's University in Queens, New York, who has written a wonderful piece in Hedgehog Review that saying that in her experience teaching college students, they want to talk about this basic question of philosophy, existential philosophy. Why is it better that I should exist as opposed to not existing? And let me tell you, when I interviewed people who had suffered mental illness for a decade, people who were fighting drug addiction, they are asking themselves this question. And my question to the audience is, do we have a good answer for them? Because if they're not productive and they're not contributing to society, why should we go on being compassionate? Now, of course, I think given the work that Professor Colosi cited about the dignity of human suffering, about the redemptive power of suffering, I personally believe in that. And I've started to present those ideas to my students alongside authors who I admire in some ways. People like Brene Brown, who I think is putting important questions on the table. Some of you also may have seen or read some of the work of Jordan Peterson, who's also addressing some of these fundamental existential questions, like where does the source of my dignity and who am I and how can I have courage to face life with strength? You know, and he's had millions of views on YouTube and his books sell like wildfire. And I think popular authors like that, who are also scholars, are pointing to the kinds of discussions that people want to have. But I'm here to say that I find personalism, and in particularly the Trinitarian concept of the person, that is so clear in authors like Dietrich von Hildebrand or Edith Stein. I find this Trinitarian concept of the person to actually be enormously useful and practical in dealing or thinking about how we can deal with questions around mental illness, with questions around addiction, and with questions around dealing with young people or really anybody who's asking themselves, why should I stay alive if I'm suffering? And that suffering, as we've just heard, it doesn't have to be physical, it can be psychological. So to sort of just say what I also saw in my interviews, that I want to point out that I think a lot of psychology and sociology could benefit from acknowledging and is beginning to acknowledge. There's some really great work being done at Divine Mercy University. In particular, I'm thinking of the work of Paul Vitz and Craig Titus, where they have developed a sort of meta model of the human person to try to bridge philosophy and theology to the psychological sciences. And one of the things that Paul Vitz said when he visited my class at Princeton Theological Seminary I teach a class on religion, resilience, and vulnerability. He said, the more that psychology wants to talk about what we just heard from our previous presenter, things like love, that human beings are fundamentally motivated by love, they're starting to go back in a way to philosophy and theology. And so I think those of us who have studied personalism can bring some of these concepts about love and about self-gift and forgiveness and bring that to the discussions that a lot of people want to have about overcoming shame and finding courage after having either been a victim of something or having chosen a path of decade of abuse of drugs. I interviewed, for example, a young man who had been abusing alcohol since he was 16 and then heroin since he was 21. And that young man is asking himself this fundamental questions: why does my life have any worth? And the only reasons he could give that he continues to fight his addictive tendencies are the love of his daughter and the love of beauty. His love of beauty expresses itself in being a tattoo artist. I spent some time in his tattoo parlor. I don't have any tattoos. He actually told me not to get any. He doesn't think that I should get any. It's kind of funny. He doesn't like girls with tattoos, but that's what he does for a living. However, there was something in his engagement or flow in the act of creating tattoos that took him out of himself. It was a form of transcendence. And I think we've forgotten this, right? That love and beauty are forms of self-transcendence, and they open up language of self-gift. And so what I have tried to do in my own work, in my own writing, and frankly, even in my own friendships where people are suffering something that you can't walk up to them and tell them is going to be cured. You know, when you're talking to someone who's battling between hope and despair because they're addicted to a drug, unfortunately, I have had 3 people that I know well have lost their husbands to suicide. And that is not the time to say, everything's going to be okay. Here's a way out. In that moment, we need to embody a kind of hope. And so what I've learned to do is to share this understanding of love and self-gift, and to encourage people who feel that they're on the brink of despair to see themselves as a person who is despite having a severe mental illness, despite being addicted to a drug, despite having the shame of losing your husband to suicide, that they have these innate capacities for love and self-gift. And if those capacities can get ignited, it can open them up then to the receptivity, to the creator, to the ultimate lover and the ultimate gift giver, that is God. And so I will, end my remarks there, but I think that these issues that we're talking about here, assisted suicide, mental illness, addiction, voluntary suicide, all of these things are on a dramatic increase. And I think they're all pointing to a fundamental view of the human person as having its worth rooted in productivity and in something external. And what I have taken from the personalists is an understanding of the person as self-gift. John Paul II, as we heard, says this beautifully in his letters. Pope Benedict, in his article, in his encyclical, in hope we are saved, right? Spe salvi. We have got to challenge the notion of the human person as being ultimately productive and history being one of eternal progress. And we have to recover a sense of God's presence in our midst, in the midst of suffering, and find a language to express God's presence in the midst of suffering to people who are having not just a physical crisis or a psychological crisis, but an existential crisis. Why should I exist, given that I have XYZ experience? And to find the language, to find the experiences of beauty, the liturgies, the accompaniment, where, to borrow words from Stanley Hauerwas, we're not trying to fix a problem, but accompany a person. So in summary, and I'll end here, the over-medicalization of issues like mental illness and addiction, where we treat the person as someone having a biological misfiring or a chemical substance abuse, and we can, inject a counter element that's going to somehow fix it, but it doesn't really fix it. At most, it stabilizes it. That approach, I think, is reaching a point where people are saying we need something more than that, and we need to recover the language of the soul, the language of the Trinitarian image of the person inside of us. And we need to recover systems, communities, schools, families that can accompany the suffering, not only in their biological and psychological needs, which I grant are there and need to be dealt with, but accompany people in that image of God that's inside of them as they grapple with their own existence and with their own frailties, and give them a message that's more hopeful than you can pick yourself up by your bootstraps. No, you have been saved by an other. And through the power of that grace, even if your life has experienced shame, or you've ravaged your body through an addiction, or you've lost a child through tragedy, you can still be capable of love and self-gift. And that is ultimately why your life is worth living.
Thank you to both of you. Some very thought-provoking comments and thoughts on these very pressing issues. We've had a number of very good questions. We're going to try to summarize some. As the moderator, I'm going to ask the first one. I think both of you kind of referenced that the move from the earlier physician-assisted suicide laws to part of what had to happen then was there needed to be a psychiatrist in the picture to rule out mental illness. Now mental illness itself has become one of the things that you can kill yourself for. And I'm thinking back to kind of a discussion that began with Peter Kramer's listening to Prozac and the raising of that issue of authenticity, identity, things like that. How do you see that type of an issue, authenticity, identity? What might the personalist vision contribute to those kinds of questions people are asking about? Who am I when I'm suffering? What is this deeper meaning that's going on now, for which some people will turn to death as the out, as the option?
I guess maybe the first thing I would say on your first question is that these laws, when they are first introduced, now I'm not saying everybody has this motive who introduces these bills, but they really are wedge laws. The reason why the first time a bill is introduced in a place where, and some people said it's called medical aid in dying now, and yes, that's what it's called even in the Rhode Island bill. I just still call it physician assisted suicide because language matters, and that's what the word suicide, uccidere, means to kill. You are, both sides agree that you're killing yourself. That's what's happening. The disagreement is on whether that's morally right or wrong. But they are wedge laws. And the reason why they build in this huge list of restrictions at the beginning is because not enough people will vote for it unless that happens. And the goal is to get that 180 shift to happen from we will never kill a person who's vulnerable to we will kill, even though they're only the ones inside these restrictions. We're going to do it. Once that happens, the real proponents of euthanasia, like Peter Singer, have already stated it's unfair to only kill people with physical terminal illnesses, which is sad. So that's what always happens. And yes, now in Canada and in Holland, that's legal to kill people with mental illnesses or with depression. But killing anyone is abandoning them, not holding their hand until they die a natural death. So I don't know, that's what occurs to me on the first part of your question. Margarita, do you want to
Thank you.
say anything?
Well, because I teach at Princeton, I love to, assign things from Peter Singer because it really ruffles people's feathers. People think I'm exaggerating his claims, but I think you're right, Peter, that he doesn't only see the slippery slope, he's like pushing people over it, right? I mean, he says things like it's not only morally justifiable, it's kind of morally imperative,
right,
to take people's pain away. And if they won't do it for themselves, why should we let someone have autonomy when they're taking resources that could fund a public school? This is his argument. And, why should we let people who love the suffering stop society from doing the right thing? In fact, we need to get in the way of people who love people suffering, because they're going to, of course, put up an objection to taking their lives of their mother, their daughter, someone who's sick. So we can't let love obstruct what needs to be done to end people's suffering. I mean, it's pretty bold.
Hey, can I comment on that?
Sure.
So, and many people probably already know this, but Peter Singer, I have this sort of we haven't talked a lot, but he read a couple of my articles and wrote me about them. And then we talked about this fact that many people are aware of, that his own mother once was in a state of dementia where she met his definition of what he calls a living human being who's not a person. And he and his sister spent a lot of money, I think tens of thousands of dollars, caring for their mother until she died a natural death. When this came out in the news, many reporters asked him about it. And finally, at one point, in a moment of exacerbation, which was published in the New Yorker magazine, the reporter, Michael Spector, kept asking him, "What about your mother?" Singer said, "Well, I don't know. In these sorts of issues, somehow it's different when it's your mother." He said that. And what I wrote was, you should philosophically ponder your meaning there. And I think the meaning there is, what's different when it's your mother? It's how much you love her. And so love actually opened his value knowledge, which is something Hildebrand would say. Love has a cognitive dimension to open your value knowledge. And then it actually influenced his behavior towards his sick mother in such a way that with respect to her alone, he behaved like, according to Catholic teaching. There's a writer, Peter Berkowitz, who wrote a scathing critique when he read that against Singer, and the title was "Other People's Mothers." meaning that Singer's willing in his writings to kill everyone who's not his mother. But what he should do is expand his ethical knowledge with what he got from this experience of love, like you're saying, which opens your eyes to the idea of being with a suffering person just because they're the person they are until they die a natural death.
Thank you for saying that, Peter. I'll just add on that, that part of the reason I tell stories about people like Laura, who I met, who was a, low wage earner, white woman in the South, or Jason, a white man in the Northeast who's addicted to heroin, is because I think if you listen to what Peter Singer says, what I then say to students is, as soon as we make this legal and I appeal to their concerns for justice, how do you not think that power structures are going to intervene such that people who are already the most vulnerable, because they don't have income, because they don't have family, because they don't have an education, why do you think the medical system is going to fairly treat everybody, right? And so I think Singer's position is very rational and it's sort of detached, and people have an emotional reaction. They're like, we just shouldn't be doing that. And then from that emotional reaction, we really shouldn't be doing that. I get them to think out. Do you really think that the powers that be are going to treat incarcerated populations with the same dignity as non-incarcerated, or with single mothers the same way they would a woman who's married with 3 children? If you give this power over life and death to a professional bureaucratic agency, why do you think they're going to make fair and just decisions according to your criteria, whatever your criteria are? I mean, we're going in a scary place. So we can move to a different question, but thank you for bringing that up.
Jim, you're muted, Jim.
Sorry, let me ask a broader question. The first one that came through on the Q&A. The recognition that over 100,000 elderly have died in nursing homes during the coronavirus pandemic. And the question was, can we see this disaster as a failure to promote the civilization of love? And if so, how should we respond to our failure to promote this civilization?
That reminds me of something I was thinking before, this question of finances. I'll come back to the nursing home thing in a second during the coronavirus, but this whole week we've been talking about what we could call a personalist ethos, especially this morning when we're talking, when Jared and JJ were talking about education and how that's the only way we're going to, with families and educations and neighborhoods, we're going to create an ethos. And it's not the case that we don't have the financial resources to care for the sick. It's that our priorities are wrong because we don't have the right underlying ethos. Someone called in a radio show once about during the Charlie Gard case and said, we can't afford all this. And I said, no, think about the NFL. We spend billions and billions of dollars on the NFL, and I'm not against football, although I'm starting to be now because it's so politicized. But you got, it's great to see top tier athletes play a game, but we have billions of dollars, so much money in that industry, in that field. We should take the players off the field to make an image, keep all the money and all the cheering, and put the sick people on the field. In other words, that's what all of our resources, if we had a personalist ethos, we would be loving people who are vulnerable with all of our effort. With respect to the people who died in the nursing homes, I mean, I know there's a range of views on that, and I'll admit I tend towards the most cynical. It seems like it almost was deliberate form of a chance to, this is very harsh, I know, and I'm willing to accept pushback, but a chance to euthanize a lot of people. Or we could at least say the underlying ethos of what happened there was motivated more by the euthanasia mentality than the care for the vulnerable, because there could have been a lot more effort put into finding ways to not have that happen.
I would just like to build on that point and say that the loneliness suffered by the elderly who died during COVID alone, I think has caused a lot of people to rethink death and dying. there is a bit of a tendency in us to want to put away the suffering, put away the dead and the dying. But now that COVID has literally prevented family members from seeing their loved ones in the hospital or visiting the elderly as they are dying, again, I'm trying to find ways to bridge, right, to the popular culture. And I find a lot of people saying, like, there's something not right about not being able to see grandma when she's close to death. And I even wonder, I mean, I'm just speculating here, right? But maybe even Peter Singer is a full human being. And by being close to his mother as she was suffering, maybe, just maybe, he had a spiritual experience that he doesn't want to acknowledge. Maybe, just maybe, he felt compassion and felt a connection and felt an attachment to the sufferer, to the person suffering. And maybe, just maybe, we can pull out of what's happened in COVID the idea that the relationships of love that we have with people when they're well are relationships that carry into their suffering, and that there's a gift to be had in redemptive suffering and in accompanying people who are suffering. So as you said, Peter, we don't have the resources for the suffering. What I think we don't have is enough people who love the suffering. And that is the most important resource. And that's the lesson from Mother Teresa. That's the lesson from people who stand in the gap and love people whose suffering isn't going to be cured. And they're not saying, oh, I'm a, savior who's doing effective altruism, and I'm using, my power and my strength, to bring good into the world. They'll tell you that they're receiving gifts. And it's like we've almost forgotten that the person suffering, I have a friend right now suffering with ALS. And he says, I feel like a burden. And I said, no, Rick, you are a gift. Your suffering is a gift to the people who love you. And we have forgotten this message. And it's an important message that I think people want to hear.
And we've been connecting a lot this week to the Catholic tradition. And if you ask people nowadays how they want to die, what do they say? In my sleep or something. There used to be a Catholic prayer that people prayed regularly that was, "Oh Lord, deliver me from a sudden death." People used to pray the opposite because they had a rich understanding of what was called the ars moriendi, the art of dying, which included family and love. And one of my friend Stan wrote in the questions, how do you explain this to people who have no faith? Well, the thing is, in a culture unlike ours, which is death averse, all people, profound things are said and experienced between loved ones who maybe they were afraid to say when death becomes close. And if you euthanize them, you cut that off. And it's not only religious people who have those. So there are redemptive experiences from dying well, living through your death as a human being. To die is actually a human act that we're actually responsible to perform well. It sounds funny, but that used to be a memento mori and ars moriendi. Those were rich traditions that we've totally lost.
Back around to, go ahead. Yeah, Peter, I want to come back around to your mention of Atul Gawande's book, Being Mortal. I teach a class on aging in the PsyD program, and we've been reading that each year for several years. And there's a funny but also poignant moment in it where you may ask, did any of your parents or grandparents who had a parlor, a front room in the house that was only used on the holidays, the furniture was covered with plastic, you knew you weren't supposed to be in there, but that's where the wakes were held. When someone died at home, the wake was right there, and you went kind of from there to the cemetery. But the immediacy of death has been removed from us. And I'm curious to hear from both of you what effect you think that has had. I mean, Gawande talks in the book as well that, why were nursing homes created? It was to get older people out of the hospital so they could bring younger people in who would get better and then go home. But we've kind of removed the dying process from many, if not most, of our lives now. And what impact might that play on what's happening as this sort of wider kind of cultural move toward things like physician-assisted suicide?
Do you want to go, Marguerite?
Well, I mean, I would just say, and also building off the last question from Stan, I mean, I think that traditions like Christianity, but also, Judaism, which has a kind of lament, and frankly, most cultures I've ever read about in the world have rituals and have ways of having death be a communal experience, an accompaniment of the dead person and a remembering of the dead. I think we need to bring those rituals back, and I think we need to make them more public. Not too long before the COVID epidemic happened, I delivered a eulogy to a 26-year-old student that I had mentored at Yale who died of cancer. And in the audience at St. Patrick's Cathedrals were people of faith and people of no faith and people seeking. And then due to COVID, we couldn't get back together again to remember him. And his father died also during COVID, leaving the widow also now childless and a widow. And when we finally got together, I wrote an article about the liturgies that we had a year and a half, almost 2 years after his death, actually 2 years after his death. I published it in the National Catholic Register. And it was a first person kind of personal account of, I called it Death is a Veil. And I talked about the experience of accompanying this man when he died, and then the experience of building a whole series of bonds and relationships with other people who loved him in life and who experienced his presence after death. And again, I couch it in Christian language and liturgy, but I think this desire to accompany the sick, to remember the dead, is a universal part of human experience. And we might stifle it in some ways culturally or medically by, prescribing antidepressants 7 days after you lose a loved one, as if feeling sad is abnormal. But I think we need to recover a sense that grief is normal, and it can actually be a way to build human bonds, and that death can, as I said, death is a veil. It shows us the symbolic dimension and points us to that eternal reality that people feel called to. And I can tell you that his friends who shared his suffering and death and grief with me, the words that I said resonated with them, even if they don't call themselves people of faith.
Actually, and now that you make those points, and connecting it, what Jim just asked about being mortal by Atul Gawande, and what Stan asked, Atul is, I don't know him, but I taught the book also, and he's not coming from a point of view of faith. I mean, his parents were more practicing a certain Indian religious Hindu maybe, but he's really not. And in fact, another thing I want to point out about the book is there's one page in there where Gawande says he does see an opening for euthanasia in cases of severe pain. So obviously we disagree with that. Palliative care we agree with. But what's interesting about his book is he has seen all this from a non-faith perspective, and it's almost the best contemporary book on how to actually create settings where a true Ars Moriendi can happen, and he has no faith. He sort of admits it in the book. He's not like a screaming atheist or anything. He's just coming from a purely natural perspective and sees it. And so I think you're right. People do have a yearning for that. And then your final remarks about the eternal, I guess we should say something about that. And it sort of goes maybe back to those utopian questions we were talking about this morning. We have to also admit, there is a sense that if there is not a real hope, which is not just a wish, and faith for a next life, then that makes euthanasia more tempting. But if we know that, because this world is the only place it has to be perfect, so you kill people. But from a faith perspective of an afterlife with God, a Christian perspective, heaven, this doesn't take away the mystery, the fear, the pain of suffering and death, but it adds an underlying, you could even say, joy, which St. Paul talks about as the third stage of going through suffering. That's what Wojtyła develops in Salvifici Doloris. And so that sort of gives us the ability to live through the dying process with our faith, and not only the natural level.
My last comment, and I know we're almost out of time, but I'll just point out that not only did John Paul II pen those beautiful words, he lived his suffering in a beautiful way. And when this young man, John Artunian, was dying, the fact that he suffered his young death in peace, and that the writings that he left and the journal reflections that he left and his final words to me and to his parents and to the priests that he was talking to, the fact that he was at peace with his suffering and death has been the strongest witness to the eternal love that he firmly believed in. And so that witness of the suffering, who do it in a holy way, I think is the best antidote to all of this mistaken ideology that denies human purpose and denies love and all these laws that are emanating out of it.
Thank you. And I think we've got time, maybe just one more quick thing. The phrase that has shown up multiple times in the chat is the phrase redemptive suffering. Would either of you like to make any kind of closing comment on that before we kind of finish up today's session? Redemptive suffering from a Christian perspective, redemptive suffering from a non-Christian perspective. So anything else you'd like to add about that notion?
Well, I think I already made my main point, which is I think the term can be applied naturally and supernaturally. And that was my answer to Stan's question, that all sorts of redemption happens between people that are very beautiful and deep that would not have happened otherwise. But then, yes, there's this Christian dimension where, St. Paul has that other line, right, where he says, I make up in my sufferings what is lacking in the suffering of Christ. And John Paul analyzes that passage in Salvifici Dolores and says that it doesn't mean Christ's suffering wasn't enough. It means that in some mysterious but very real way, Christ actually enables us to participate in his redemptive suffering. We do. It seems like a contradiction to our puny intellects that if his is enough, how can we? But just accept that as a mystery. We actually do. Our suffering is meaningful in that regard, and we can, in some mysterious way, offer it to God for the redemption of people we love or the people who have fallen away from the faith. And it is efficacious. And sometimes you see the fruits of that, and sometimes you don't, but it's real. And John Paul develops that in Salvifici Dolores.
I'll just echo that. I think you said it beautifully, Peter. I think at times the term redemptive suffering can be akin to what's meant by the word resilience on a natural level, that people can grow from adversity and you can see some fruit in your own life that comes through suffering. And we should affirm that, right? Like without suffering, without discipline, you don't grow in the virtues. And hey, look, this bad thing happened to you and now something great's going to happen. However, that's not what you say to someone whose family member has committed suicide or died of cancer. Like you can't say that. So then the supernatural, right, and the transcendent dimension of the redemptive suffering, the eternal, is what you talk about. And so I think that the term redemptive suffering in the case of the eternal would point to what I was just saying. We need to return to actually rituals of remembering the dead. When my former student told me that his father had committed suicide, what I said to him was that I would offer mass for his father, and that, he should really make sure he practices the liturgy, because it's in the liturgy that we encounter the dead, right? It's about the communion of saints. It's like making the redemptive suffering of Jesus present in the liturgy. And to the extent that we've forgotten that, I think we've deprived people of a real spiritual gift of just learning to be present in suffering. So what I think that young woman was saying to me, I want to feel like a person. Other people have said to me, I need to be present to my suffering. I don't want to stifle it. And bringing that presence, that suffering into the liturgy and bringing our whole selves. And this is the other article I wrote about, which I think was part of this, in the article I wrote Already and Not Yet in First Things, how the liturgy has helped me be able to be present to the emotions caused by this suffering that I've seen in the last year and a half, and heal them not in a way where the dead come back to life, because they don't, but heal them in a way that rather than give in to despair and not knowing what to say to my friends who are suffering these horrible things, that I just have the strength to get up and try to be the hands and feet of Jesus to people of all faiths or no faith whose lives have been marked by some kind of horrible tragedy.
It's a wonderful closing thought, and we're just about at 3 o'clock now, so we do need to end. We had more questions that we could possibly deal with in just 1 hour, but I do want to remind folks there will be a panel discussion with all the faculty tomorrow at noontime. So if you had questions you wanted to pose in that venue, certainly voice them again, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. So we'll take a few minutes now for a break. Peter and Margarita, thank you so much for some very wonderful ideas and opening us to some new ways of thinking about some of the deepest questions in life.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.